Millions of people recognize this diner. Tourists have spent decades searching New York, trying to find it in real life. It was never there. It never existed anywhere at all. And the two people at the counter, sitting like total strangers, they're actually a married couple, and one of them is the artist himself. This is Nighthawks, painted by Edward Hopper, completed on the 21st of January, 1942. It shows an all-night diner on an empty city street, 3 customers. One counter attendant, lit up like a stage under fluorescent light, surrounded by total darkness. The street outside is completely empty. No cars, no other pedestrians, not even a stray cat, just clean pavement and the long shadow the diner itself casts across it, as if this one lit room is the only thing still awake in the entire city. Above the diner, a faded cigar advertisement is still visible on the building behind it, a small, mundane detail of everyday commerce, included with the same careful attention Hopper gave to every figure inside. Nothing in this street is generic filler. Every sign, every shadow was placed on purpose. It's one of the most reproduced, most parodied images in the history of American art, and almost every detail people assume about it turns out to be more complicated than it looks. Even the shape of the canvas is unusual for its time, a long, panoramic width, closer to a movie screen than a typical framed painting, built specifically to let that empty street stretch out on one side, while the lit diner glows on the other. Hopper always claimed this diner was based on something real, a place he'd actually seen on a corner in Greenwich Village. For decades, art fans took that seriously enough to go looking for it. Some claim to identify the exact corner. Others spent years trying to match the architecture to old city photographs. In 2010, the New York Times reported that researchers were finally confident about the answer. That specific diner never existed. Hopper had almost certainly invented it, blending pieces of different places into a location that was never real in the first place. That habit wasn't unique to this one painting either. Hopper regularly combined real buildings, real storefronts, and real streets. He'd sketch separately into single scenes that never matched any actual address, treating New York less like a city to document and more like a box of parts he could rearrange freely. Think about how strange that hunt actually was. People weren't chasing a rumor about some obscure background detail. They were searching for the exact address of what might be the most famous diner in American culture, and the trail simply ran out, decade after decade. Now look at the two people sitting together at the counter. They read like strangers, a man in a hat, a red-haired woman, sharing space, but not quite looking at each other. They're not strangers at all. Edward Hopper painted himself as both male figures, working from his own reflection in a mirror. His wife, Josephine Jo, posed for the woman in red. The loneliest-looking couple in American art is, in real life, one of the most famous marriages in it. Hopper painted himself constantly throughout his career, this way studying his own face and posture in a mirror, rather than hiring outside models. Jo, a trained painter herself before she became known mainly as his wife, modelled for nearly every female figure he ever painted. Not just this one. The painting looks almost effortless, a single frozen moment, glanced at once and remembered forever. It wasn't effortless at all. At least 19 separate preliminary drawings survive for Nighthawks' studies in chalk and charcoal, working out the exact angle of the architecture, the precise spacing of the figures around the counter, even small details, like the shape of the coffee urns. Hopper himself described his process as a long, slow gestation, small sketches of the whole scene, then separate sketches of individual details, refined again and again before he ever touched the final canvas. Most of that groundwork happened on foot. Hopper would walk the streets of New York for hours first, sketching fragments of buildings and storefronts as he found them, then bring those fragments back to the studio to be rearranged, tested, and combined long before a single brushstroke of paint touched the canvas. Nothing in this painting is spontaneous. Every shadow, every gap between figures was planned and replanned like a stage set, long before it ever looked this effortless. The timing here matters more than most people realize. Hopper finished this painting on the 21st of January, 1942, just 6 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, while the entire country was bracing for the possibility of more attacks on home soil. Joe Hopper's own diary from those exact weeks describes real fear of bombing raids, living under a glass skylight roof that offered no protection at all. Hopper himself, according to Joe, refused to take any real interest in the danger. Whether that anxiety shows up in this painting on purpose or not is something historians still debate, but the timing is impossible to ignore. Picture the two most common wartime instructions of that exact moment: stay inside and black out your windows after dark. Hopper painted the exact opposite scene: a room blazing with light, fully exposed behind glass, open to anyone watching from the dark street. Intentional commentary or not, it's a strange image to finish 6 weeks into a war defined by hiding. New York itself would introduce real dim-out restrictions along the coast within months of this painting's completion, meaning the kind of brightly lit storefront Hopper painted here was, very shortly afterward, something the city began legally requiring people to stop doing. Here's a detail almost everyone gets wrong just from the title alone. Nighthawks sounds like it should be about birds, or maybe some kind of nighttime predator circling the scene. According to Joe Hopper's own notes, the name actually comes from the hooked, beak-like nose of the man in the hat sitting next to the woman. Nighthawk was period slang for someone who stayed out late. The title isn't about wildlife. It's a nickname, hiding in plain sight on a single face. And here's the detail that changes how the entire painting is meant to be experienced, something almost nobody notices until it's pointed out. Look carefully at the diner itself. There is no door. Hopper deliberately painted the corner as a seamless wedge of glass with no visible entrance anywhere in the composition, which means, the viewer, you aren't just watching this scene from across the street. You've been architecturally locked out of it. There is no way in, even in theory. Hopper gave you a warmly lit room full of people, and then made absolutely sure you could never actually join them. For a painting this famous, its price tag is almost funny in hindsight. The Art Institute of Chicago bought Nighthawks the same year it was painted, in 1942, for $3,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $57,000 today, the price of a used car, for what's now considered one of the defining images of 20th century American art. The Art Institute didn't buy it as a speculative investment either. They simply liked it enough to want it in the building the same year it was finished, decades before anyone was calling it iconic. That modest price makes a lot more sense once you know what Hopper's career actually looked like before this painting. Starting in 1905, Hopper spent nearly 20 years working as a commercial illustrator, drawing advertisements and magazine illustrations he openly disliked, just to pay rent, while the paintings he actually wanted to make sat unsold. He didn't get his first real breakthrough until his early 40s, when a solo watercolor show finally sold out. Only then could he afford to stop illustrating and paint full-time. By the time he painted Nighthawks at 59 years old, Hopper had already spent roughly 2 decades of his adult life drawing things he didn't care about, waiting for permission to paint the kind of quiet, lonely scene that would eventually define him. It's worth sitting with that timeline for a second. The defining image of American isolation wasn't painted by a young, struggling artist working it out in real time. It was painted by a man in his late 50s, looking back at decades of exactly that kind of isolation from the other side of it. That gap between price and fame only grew from there. Nighthawks may be the single most parodied painting in art history. Cartoon characters, movie posters, dogs playing poker, entire album covers the composition, gets borrowed constantly. The most famous version might be Gottfried Helmwein's Boulevard of Broken Dreams, which swaps Hopper's anonymous diner customers for James Dean, Marilyn Monroe, Humphrey Bogart, and Elvis Presley, 4 dead icons, sitting together in the same lonely light. According to actor J.K. Simmons, speaking in a documentary about Hopper, part of the reason it gets copied so often is painfully simple. The composition is stark and clean enough that almost any moderately skilled artist can imitate it convincingly. That simplicity is deceptive, though. Plenty of easy-to-copy images get forgotten within a year. This one has been redrawn for over 80 years straight, across completely different media, by people who never met each other and never coordinated anything, which suggests the shape of it is doing something more than just being easy to trace. It's a strange kind of immortality. 4 painted strangers in a diner that never existed have appeared in more places, in more disguises, than almost any real photograph from the same decade. Directors have leaned on it just as hard as illustrators. Filmmakers working in film noir and neo-noir have cited this exact composition for decades. The same hard light, the same glass barrier between a warm interior and a cold, empty street outside. Long after most people watching had forgotten or never knew where the look originally came from, the loneliness at the center of this painting didn't come out of nowhere either. Decades earlier, a young Hopper traveled to Europe and studied French painters obsessively, especially the way Manet and Degas painted isolated women in cafes and bars, watched from a slight distance by someone who was never quite part of the scene. Manet's a bar at the Follies Bergère and Degas's in a cafe. Both use that same quiet, voyeuristic distance, a European idea Hopper carried home and eventually planted on an American street corner that didn't even exist. Even the glass itself has a European ancestor. Manet's barmaid stands behind her own reflective counter, half blocked from the viewer by glass, and bottles the same kind of transparent barrier Hopper would later use to lock an entire American city out of a diner that never existed. It took him decades to fully make that idea his own. Nighthawks arrived near the end of a long, slow apprenticeship to a feeling he'd first noticed in Paris cafes as a young man, and didn't finish translating into distinctly American loneliness until he was almost 60. Hopper himself put it more simply than any critic ever has. Unconsciously, probably, I was painting the loneliness of a large city. So look at this painting one more time, the one on coffee mugs, in Simpsons gags, in 100 parody versions. You've probably seen, without ever knowing the original name, a diner that never existed anywhere, built entirely out of memory and invention, searched for in vain, for decades by people who assumed it had to be real. A married couple sitting together in paint, made to look like strangers to each other. 19 quiet drawings behind one painting that looks like it took 10 minutes. A title borrowed from a stranger's nose, not a bird. A city bracing for war just weeks earlier, whether or not that fear made it onto the canvas on purpose. 20 years of illustration work Hopper never wanted, traded for one career he finally did. A $3,000 purchase that turned into one of the most copied images ever painted, and a room full of warm light that you, the viewer, were never actually invited into. No door, no way in, by design. Hopper said he was painting loneliness without quite meaning to. So when you look at this scene, are you keeping those 4 people company? Or are you the reason none of them are speaking?